So welcome. And again, this is Laura Bryant. Thank you for joining us. We have so many terrific programs at the Merowith Center, and Presidential Legacies has turned out to be one of our favorites. Thus far, we've featured 4 U.S. presidents: Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon Johnson, Harry Truman, and Franklin Roosevelt, plus First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. Today, we're kicking off the extraordinary lives of Jimmy and Rosalynn Carter. It's a 3-part series, and this afternoon is part 1. Next month, part 2 will cover the Camp David Accords, and in October, part 3 will cover the life of the First Lady. Here to tell the Carters' extraordinary story is Josh Montanari, Education Specialist at the Jimmy Carter Presidential Library, which, as you may know, is part of the Presidential Library System administered by the federal government, the National Archives and Records Administration. Josh, we know that President Carter is currently in hospice, with the family spending a lot of time with him and his wife. So thank you for taking the time to be with us today and tell the backstory of Jimmy Carter's life and leadership before, during, and after the White House.
You're very welcome. It's great to be here with everyone today. As Laura mentioned, I'm the education specialist at the Carter Presidential Library in Atlanta, Georgia. We share a campus with the nonprofit Carter Center. The organization was founded by the Carters after they left the White House. I'll talk a little bit about them as well and their work since that time. Yes, President Carter has been in hospice since, I believe, January. We hear a lot of people saying he's redefining hospice care. A lot of folks tend to think it's a short process, but it can be relatively normal for it to go on longer. Hospice is just when you're refusing additional medical attention, intervention, whatnot, to prolong life. But President Carter is at home with his wife, Rosalynn, and family around. There's not a lot of details being released about it, except that they are just at home and enjoying each other and enjoying the company of their family and friends there in their small town of Plains, Georgia, which is still about the same size as it was when they were young and upcoming. And I'll talk a little bit about that today. So I will go ahead. Be nice if speaker could move more into the light. Let me see. I 1 second. Let me try to get a little bit more light on me. It is a little dark here. Okay, does that help at all? Okay, I look a little brighter. See, I think you got a glare on my head now, so that's a good sign.
Thanks for the extra light.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and begin to share my screen. So just give me a moment while that loads and we'll get started. Let's see, slideshow from the beginning. Okay, all right, well, that went over pretty quick. So yes, we are here to talk about the extraordinary life of Jimmy Carter, our 39th president, and so far the only president from the state of Georgia. As Laura mentioned, the Carter Library is a unit of the National Archives and Records Administration. Folks tend to think of it as just a DC-centered agency, but we actually have about 40 facilities across the nation, although our DC facilities are very prominent. In fact, the photograph you're seeing on your screen, it looks like something very somber, almost like a funeral, but it's actually a very joyous occasion. What those folks are carrying from that armored vehicle are our nation's founding documents to be displayed in the National Archives building in Washington. So that would be the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and I believe a copy of the Magna Carta. And those are still on display in Washington to this day. The public can go and see those during regular business hours. Soon they will also be adding a page of the Emancipation Proclamation. There's 5 pages of that document, and they'll rotate the 5 pages over time. So there will be a new edition in that rotunda if you go to Washington and see that. So the presidential libraries were begun by Franklin Roosevelt At that time, when he was president, a lot was going on in his administration, and he realized that our government was not keeping very good track of its records, particularly with regards to presidents. Often they were destroyed, lost, sold, kept as personal papers when presidents left office. He wanted to establish a system for accountability there. After he established his predecessor, Herbert Hoover, decided he wanted one as well. So basically every presidential library from Herbert Hoover up through President Trump, their collections, their archival collections are managed by the National Archives and Records Administration. Traditionally, the model as far as the public-facing facility went was the outgoing president had to raise the funds for the real estate and construction, and then management of the facility itself would be handed over to the National Archives. We are seeing that model change a little bit. The Obama Library is going to be opening as a private institution run by the Obama Foundation. The George W. Bush Library in Texas is now going to be run by his foundation. We don't know if President Trump will have a public-facing library you can come and visit or not. However, regardless, his collection will still be managed by the National Archives and Records Administration. Our collection, just a real quick overview. Well, we opened on October 1st, 1986. That is Jimmy Carter's birthday. If he's still with us by that time, he will be 99 years old, I believe. We have 40 million pages of written materials in containers like the ones you see in the photograph there from our museum floor. It gives you a little bit of a glimpse into our collection. As far as artifacts, over 40,000 objects and artifacts, over 500,000 photographs, and over 3,000 hours of film and audio. And all of these are materials you can come to our site and working with our archival staff, you can research these and access these in our research room. So these are available to the public to see. But really the crux of what we do is preserving the primary sources of our nation's history. We are the nation's record keeper, and we do that because having access to this helps us see original intent and context. Images, film, and audio help us to see things we can't see from written words on paper and tangible things. They help us consider multiple perspectives. They help us understand each other better, to see all sides of a topic. Most importantly, I like to think that when you come and do research and access our materials, it inspires you to do further research and prompts further inquiry. So that's really the bread and butter of our business. And so we have a great collection on the lives of President and Mrs. Carter. What I'll be talking about today is his early life, his adult life, political life, and then the post-presidency, what they've been up to since they left the White House in 1981. Got a nice picture there of President and Mrs. Carter at one of their inauguration balls in January 1977. We're going to go back to the beginning now. Carter's early life. There we see a picture of him as a boy with his little dog Bozo there. This is 1937, so Carter is 13 or 14 years old in that picture. So about an 7th or 8th grader, I think. So what is the secret to an extraordinary life? So we'll be just kind of analyzing some of these phases of Carter's life, seeing if we can get to an answer of that question. Maybe it's having at least one extraordinary parent. His mother, Miss Lillian Carter, she does make him the first president born in a hospital in 1924. And that was kind of by accident, but a testament to her public service. She was volunteering as a nurse at a sanitarium when she went into labor with Jimmy Carter. And that was in addition to her regular paid duties as a nurse. So that kind of, it's like a benchmark in presidential history. So first president born in a medical facility. His mother in the times of Jim Crow ignored those rules of segregation, much to her husband's dismay. Her husband, who may not have agreed with it, still upheld it in the public's eye, so to speak. Miss Lillian volunteers at the age of 68 to join the Peace Corps in India, of all places. You know, a lot of folks think the Peace Corps is always, digging a well somewhere in a third world country. A lot of folks, well, there's some cushy posts in the Peace Corps. I've met people who've lived in castles in Eastern Europe and things like that. But Lillian Carter did not do that. She kind of went to that traditional definition of the Peace Corps and went to India at a relatively advanced age as she's getting into her later years. And that's typically a 2-year commitment where you don't come home and see friends or family for that time. And I think that was a huge inspiration for Carter when he thought about his post-presidency. And he was relatively young for that, leaving the White House in his 50s. But she was always Jimmy's biggest fan, as we've seen that photograph on the right, the night that he won the 1976 presidential election. That football jersey, she was hiding under her trench coat. Maybe having an extraordinary home contributes to the character necessary to lead an extraordinary life. The house you see there is the house that Carter spends most of his childhood and adolescence in. That's in the small town of Archery, just down the road from the small town of Plains. When I say small town of Plains, it had about 350 people then. It still has around 350 people in it today. Now, that house was built by the previous owners in 1922. They ordered it as a kit from the Sears and Roebuck catalog. I don't know if we have too many folks doing that these days, or just order a house and the parts and we'll figure out how to put it together. But they did that. The Carters were the second family in the house, but no running water. That's from a well that you can still observe if you go there today. They did not have any electricity until the New Deal years in the Roosevelt administration, when we had the Rural Electrification Act, which was a big game changer for the Carters then. Maybe some relevance today. At that time, the argument was, are people entitled to utilities like water and gas, electricity? And we have today the debate is, aren't people entitled to internet, Wi-Fi, high-speed access? So it kind of has a modern counterpart. As I mentioned, you can visit this house now. It is a part of the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park. So that is managed by the National Park Service. And that includes this home that they give regular tours of. They have preserved a portion of the farmland there, not all of what the Carters originally had, but they do have a contractor that maintains that. You can see some pecan trees on the site there. You can see tennis courts, clay courts, naturally, here in Georgia, that his father built. Jimmy and his father played a lot of tennis. He commented that his father was hard to beat. You'll also see some of the structures of tenant farmers that lived on the property. And those were a lot of the folks that actually spent a lot of time raising Carter when his parents were busy. Just for reference, this is about, I'd say, 3 hours southwest of Atlanta, Georgia. Maybe hard work and doing good at school. I think that doesn't hurt to build an extraordinary life. We see Carter there on a horse on the farm. One of his books was entitled An Hour Before Daylight, because that was typically when he woke up in his childhood to do farm chores. He also did a little entrepreneurial business before school, selling peanuts and ice cream in town. But a quote that stuck with me was, from one of his books, was that farming when he was a child was closer to the Stone Age than modern farming. It gives you an idea of the advancement in agriculture that occurred in the 20th century, when initially folks weren't doing things too much different than folks were thousands of years before them. And it's really come a long way. Now, a great primary source we have on display in our museum is Jimmy Carter's 6th grade report card. And you see that on the right-hand side of the screen. And, you can deduce some other living conditions from looking at this card. When we see a lot of A's on there. Let's see, except for, we get to music at the bottom. Oh, there's a B, a C. Jimmy slipped up a little music. However, maybe the joke's on this teacher, because he does grow up to win a Grammy. Not so much for singing, but for best spoken word album, basically recording an audiobook. And that's an honor he shares with Presidents Clinton and Obama. But we look at the very last row there. We see the subject. It's not printed on the card, but written in pen there, Heath. And we just see grades of okay. So we can perhaps deduce when we look at this that maybe there weren't so many dentists available in southwestern Georgia in the early 20th century. And it appears it is teachers' jobs to kind of give a look into their students' mouths. And we can imagine they don't have too much technical training. We can maybe infer that from the grades given, just, okay, no details, nothing about cavities or anything else like that. Spaces in the gums, things of that nature, just okay. But then again, we put that together with the fact that he's born in a hospital just because his mother's having to volunteer as a nurse to fill in at a short-staffed sanitarium. So we can kind of put those pieces together and just maybe assume that holistically, there's just not a lot of medical personnel, at least not as much as they needed in Southwest Georgia when Carter's growing up. And that's a great example of how the lens we should look at all primary sources, whether it's a photograph, an artifact like this, a document, audio, video, what can we deduce from them? What are obvious things and what are things that aren't so obvious and maybe make our gears turn a little bit? And that's one of those great examples. So we'll get into Carter's adult life. We see the photograph on the screen there of President and Mrs. Carter on their wedding day in 1946, which I think it's July 7th, 1946. So maybe a secret is, part of that secret is having inspiration in your life. Carter had a big inspiration in the form of his uncle Tom Gordy. That's his mother Lillian's brother. You can see him in that photograph there on the left in the back, and that's taken at Andersonville National Historic Site, which is just down the road from Plains, Georgia, where the Jimmy Carter National Historical Park is. For those that don't know, that was the site of a POW camp where Confederate military held Union prisoners of war in the Civil War. Very notorious for maltreatment of prisoners, where you might have seen photographs where the prisoners basically look like very similar to folks in concentration camps in the Second World War. But what they have there is the National Prisoner of War Museum. So you have the Civil War site and then the National POW Museum, which covers all American wars. Now, his uncle Tom Gordy was in the United States Navy. Carter didn't get to see him very much. He was always off around the world, different places. He would get letters, postcards, things like that. So it naturally sparked Carter's fascination with being in the Navy. He's resolved to join, like his uncle Tom, request a catalog from the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis before he even entered high school. And we'll see that he does make good on that. But his uncle Tom he becomes a prisoner of war in the Second World War. And the family does not hear anything. Eventually, he is assumed dead, which is what the family is told. It turns out not to be the case. He turns up back home. Sadly for him, his wife has moved on and remarried. So it puts a little bit of a strain in the family there. Carter writes a poem about it called The Ballad of Tom Gordy. Carter is a big fan of poetry, loves to write his own poetry. The writing might be a little small, so I'm going to go ahead and read out loud The Ballad of Tom Gordy. So in 41, the Japanese took our troops on Guam. Alive or dead, we didn't know. One was my Uncle Tom. He was the Navy boxing champ, my hero with his crown. Now with him gone, his family moved down to our Georgia town. My grandma and my aunts felt Tom was not his wife's, but theirs. She could feel the coolness, but stayed on to join their prayers. What bound them all together was the hope and faith and dread. When 2 years passed, the dispatch came. My Uncle Tom was dead. His wife and kids moved back out west to start their lives again. And after Tom was gone 3 years, she wed a family friend. The end of war brought startling news. Tom Gordy was alive. 4 years he had been digging coal deep in a mountainside. The women took the feeble Tom and smothered him with care. He never would tell anyone what happened over there. Tom Gordy soon regained some strength and craved a normal life. but mother and sisters told him lies about his absent wife. Betraying him, Tom wanted her, but couldn't figure how to bring her back or overcome her second marriage vow. He got 4 years back pay and made Commander, USN. It didn't take him long to find a woman's love again. Tom closed the past except when his 3 children came to stay. When I would mention his first wife, he'd always turn away. Once my submarine tied up where she lived with her kin. I went to visit them, afraid they wouldn't let me in. But all the folks they knew were called when I first gave my name. All night we danced and sang because at least Tom's nephew came. There's a bit of accounting of that family history and about the person that does inspire Carter to get into the Navy. So he graduates Plain High School, 1941, attends Georgia Southwestern College in Americus, nearby Plains, for 1 year. There he studies mathematics to qualify for the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, which is the most prestigious institution for the United States Navy. He receives his appointment in 1943, of course, during World War II. He is part of a 3-year accelerated program. So he's technically the class of 1947. That is how he is documented, but he does graduate in 1946. So even though the war had ended in 1945, they still maintained the accelerated program. So when he graduates in 1946, receives his first commission as ensign and marries Rosalynn Smith on July 7th, 1946. There you can see reproductions of what they were wearing on their wedding day. Those are on display in our museum. A lot of folks think Mrs. Carter looked like Little Debbie from the snack box. Thinking maybe all can see that. And his first assignment was in Norfolk, Virginia. So that is where they move and begin their lives together. So he's in the Navy from 1946 to 1953, at least on active duty. He serves on surface ships and diesel electric submarines in both the Atlantic and Pacific fleets. We see him there in the photograph, standing behind the seated men and behind the gentleman looking through the periscope. When he gets out of Naval Academy, he attends the Navy's submarine school, studying reactor technology and nuclear physics. So we really have to think about the times, like submarines first deployed in military conflicts, I believe the United States Civil War by the Confederate military, the Hunley, which was found and resurrected, I believe off the coast of I think it's North Carolina, where that was, but we're still kind of tinkering around with a lot of stuff in submarines at that time. And now we are finding out how to power them with nuclear energy. Carter says that he signed up for this because it was the most elite program in the United States Navy at that time, and he wanted to be among the best. So that is why he joins this. A lot of people think President Carter was a nuclear physicist, or is. It's not so much he's a nuclear physicist as he's a nuclear reactor technician, if that makes sense. So he didn't, let's just say he didn't engineer the car, he's the mechanic. So that's President Carter's relationship with nuclear reactors. He does come to be a senior officer on the USS K-1, one of the first 2 nuclear-powered submarines in the United States Navy. He might have learned a thing or two about leadership and remaining calm under pressure during his time there. Now, this is a later photograph when he's president, but we see him meeting with his commander when he was in the Navy, Admiral Rickover. And I think the quote there is very powerful. That's second to his own father, that Rickover had more effect on his life than any other man. And what I've read about his time in the Navy and with Admiral Rickover was extremely rigid, always testing the men under his command, how they reacted to stress, how they reacted to being irritated. Carter recalled being called into Rickover's office to have a conversation about his preference of music. And when Carter would tell him music that he enjoyed and liked and composers he admired, Rickover would say, well, that's just, he would kind of try to get him fired up and prod him. Well, that's ridiculous. This composer was mediocre. Their music is flaccid and boring, things like that. And to see how Carter would respond to him. So we can only imagine how many other conversations they had that were really tests in disguise for Carter and his colleagues. The leadership was really put to the test in 1952 when the world saw its first nuclear meltdown in Ottawa, Canada. The Chalk River Laboratory did have a release of radioactive material. Carter is tapped to train and lead a team of 23 personnel to repair a nuclear reactor. Now, again, just like submarines being new, nuclear energy being very new, repairing them is also very new. At that time, they were training to work in 90-second increments to limit their exposure to radiation. President Carter has stated that he tested positive for radiation approximately 6 months after this assignment, and that we know now with the levels of radiation he was exposed to, with today's standards, every 90 seconds someone was working in there, they were exposed to about a year's threshold of radiation exposure by today's standard. I like to joke that it sounds like the origin story of a superhero. Maybe this exposure to radiation has had something to do with President Carter's amazing endurance over the years. But much to his credit on that assignment, they do get that reactor repaired. It is up and working 2 years later. So it was a successful mission. And one way or the other, the crew survived all of that exposure to radiation that they experienced. Now, he does leave the Navy, and that is because of his father's passing in 1953. His father passes away from pancreatic cancer. Sadly, actually, all of Carter's siblings, his 2 sisters, Gloria and Ruth, and his brother Billy, would also succumb to pancreatic cancer. A lot of folks think it perhaps had something to do with pesticides, fertilizers, things like that, living in an agricultural community. So Carter feels it incumbent upon himself to come home, take up the reins of the family business as the eldest child. It's much to Mrs. Carter's chagrin. She does not agree with that decision. He makes this unilaterally. Carter recalls that their car ride home to Georgia, she would not speak to him directly, but through their sons. Tell your father to pull over for dinner, things like that. Maybe she had good reason because they get back. They only make about a $250 profit. The first year they're living in public housing. In fact, that apartment where they live can still be visited, and you can see a plaque on the outside informing folks of the famous occupant it had. But Carter really turns around the business, building relationships in the community. He's involved on the school board. He's involved in the library board, Future Farmers of America. But a big one he credits is joining the Lions Club. I'm not sure if we have any Lions Club members with us today, but Carter has said that if it were not for the Lions Club, he could have never became governor of Georgia, let alone president, because he does eventually rise to the position of as head of all the Lions Clubs in the state of Georgia. When you think about it, it's probably a pretty effective networking tool for getting over into politics. So that's what we're going to talk about now is political life. There we see the White House 5 days before Carter becomes its resident. And this is January 15th, 1977. So Carter first enters politics by running for state senate in 1963. He initially loses this election. However, a local reporter does a little more probing into the election. He finds that a lot of folks in the local cemetery somehow made their way to the polls to vote for Carter's opponent that day. It only took a handful of votes to sway the outcome given the rural location, sparse population there. So Carter actually follows his father. His father had been elected as a state senator, and he joins the Georgia legislative branch. He's there for 2 terms. He does try to first run for governor in 1966. he loses to a man named Lester Maddox, who had a bit of notoriety. Lester Maddox was an ardent segregationist. He owned a restaurant in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, even after the Supreme Court rules on integration. He continues to bar Black patrons from his restaurant, notorious for chasing them with an axe handle. His slogan was "No, not one," meaning not one white or not one Black child will enter a white school. So Carter loses to him, and despite having different views on race, among other things, he does support Lester Maddox in the general election for governor. So Lester Maddox does win that. Carter comes back in 1970. At the time, you can only be governor of Georgia for one term. He wins that election. However, Lester Maddox is now his lieutenant governor because he had not held that office. And by all accounts, Maddox does give Carter a bit of a hard time during his time as governor of Georgia. But that spring, so it was a big shift going from Lester Maddox to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter became part of what came to be called the New South, which was a wave of anti-racist Democrats who were winning public office in the southeastern United States in the 1970s. So I'm going to play a video clip here, just a little over a minute, of Carter's inaugural speech as governor. But again, this was transitioning from Maddox, an ardent segregationist, who would have been in the audience, actually would have been sitting right behind him, just out of the view of the camera there that day.
At the end of a long campaign, I believe I know our people of this state as well as anyone could.
Sorry, on the white pause.
Based on this knowledge of Georgians, North and South, rural and urban, liberal and conservative, I say to you quite frankly that the time for racial discrimination is over. Our people have already made this major and difficult decision, but we cannot underestimate the challenge of hundreds of minor decisions yet to be made. Our inherent human charity and our religious beliefs will be taxed to the limit. No poor, rural, weak, or Black person should ever have to bear the additional burden of being deprived of the opportunity of an education, a job, or simple justice.
Okay. So he's governor of Georgia. He does that for 4 years. Decides he wants to keep going, keep building momentum in his political career. I don't think he ever really considered a run for House of Representatives or the United States Senate. He just went right to the top and throws his hat in the ring for the presidency of the United States. Maybe the secret to having extraordinary life was having really close, dedicated friends. Jimmy Carter was in no short supply of those. So we see in the photograph here, maybe some folks with us today were part of the Peanut Brigade, but that was friends, family, neighbors, went all over the country on behalf of Jimmy Carter, helped him pull some really big upsets. I know today we often look to New Hampshire and Iowa early in election seasons, and the reason for that being is because in the 1976 primary election for the Democratic Party, Carter was slated to come in last place in both of those contests, and he comes out on top in first place. That created a lasting political tradition. But we have a lot of memorabilia, artifacts from the campaign, from the Peanut Brigade on display in our museum and our election section that folks can still see today. In fact, we kind of have to turn folks away with donations. We get a lot of folks that come by and say, hey, we found this bag or this box, and our parents' attic had all these Jimmy Carter signs and bumper stickers. We're kind of overflowed with them, so we're not really accepting any of those at this time, because I guess it's considered a redundant objects in our collections because we have so many. So I would say if you have any, hold on to those, maybe pass them down to your own family. So we've got plenty. Maybe a secret to extraordinary life is building new relationships. Now, Carter was really at a crossroads for a lot of things happening in our country at the time. And I think it's important for us to remember that with any president. It's seldom that things they do begin and end with them. Oftentimes it begins in previous administrations and they don't have time to finish it during their own when it goes to their successors. That was the case for Jimmy Carter on a few things, with things that started in the Nixon administration and the Ford administration. One of those being opening up relations with China. Typically, we think of Richard Nixon. He starts the dialogue with China, who we did not have diplomatic relations with following their communist revolution in the 1950s. But Nixon opens that conversation. President Ford continues the conversation. Jimmy Carter finishes it when he formally establishes diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. We see him with a photo in the photograph there with Deng Xiaoping, who's the leader of China that time in 1979. Now, I personally was in an audience of President Carter's when I brought the library's interns down to Plains, Georgia to have an audience with President Carter. He was also meeting with Carter Center interns. They have a lot of them at the Carter Center next door, the nonprofit that they run. They get about 50 interns a semester. I get about 2. But they let us piggyback on some of the things that they do. So we joined them down there. President Carter spoke with us at the Visitor Center for the National Park there, which was his old school. And we had a student ask him what was the most significant thing he did as president. And surprisingly, I was expecting to hear the Camp David Accords, Panama Canal treaties, getting all 52 American hostages from Iran home safe. But without hesitation, President Carter said establishing diplomatic relations with China was his most significant accomplishment, because he couldn't imagine a world where we just pretended that the most populous nation on earth, although I think India is currently, it seesaws back and forth, but at the time that the most populous nation on earth, we would just pretend they didn't exist. So this is what I've personally heard him say in an engagement, which is, I think, maybe surprising for a lot of folks. Carter is known for his diplomatic prowess. Maybe that is part of that secret as well, helping friends make peace. The Camp David Accords, as I mentioned, a lot of folks probably think that's the most significant accomplishment of his presidency. More than 40 years later, it's still intact. Egypt and Israel had been at war for more than 40 years with each other. Relations begin to thaw. And the United States realizes you kind of have to go after Egypt to get peace. Egypt typically was the de facto leader of Pan-Arabism in the 60s and 70s. They had been initiating and spearheading a lot of the conflicts with Israel. So Carter gets Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, to come to Camp David in Maryland, which is about half hour outside of Washington, D.C. They think it was just going to be a weekend. It turns into 13 days, almost 2 weeks, which is, when we think about it, it's almost unprecedented in modern times that any president spends 2 weeks in one location working on one thing. During that time, Walter Mondale was pretty busy handling everything else that Carter usually would have been doing. But we do see on the very last day, Carter somehow makes a break in what was happening, because they really had been failing up to that point. 12 days, they just could not get these two sides to agree on much. He has a breakthrough on the third day. We see a photograph of what Carter attributes it to, which we can't really find in words. When we look at the President's Daily Diary, which are all available on our website almost every day of his administration, we see a lot of conversations and phone calls, but we it's hard to tell what is the breakthrough. Well, in the next slide, we have President Carter giving us a personal account of what the breakthrough was in securing the Camp David Accords.
The last day was a turning point because we thought we had failed. And we were getting ready to leave Camp David in failure and go back to Washington and announce that we had not been successful. And Prime Minister Begin asked me if I would sign a photograph for his 8 grandchildren of me and Begin and Sadat. And I agreed to do it. And my secretary, whose name was Susan Clow, got the names of Begin's 8 grandchildren from Israel. She called over there and got their names. So instead of saying best wishes, Jimmy Carter, I said with love and best wishes to, and I put down his grandchild's name and I signed it. And I took it over to his cabin to tell him goodbye. And when he opened the door, he was very angry with me. And he said, "Good afternoon, Mr. President." He was always very proper. And I said, "Good afternoon, Mr. Prime Minister, and I'm sorry we hadn't been successful. I brought the photographs you asked for," and I gave the photographs to him. And he turned around and said, "Thank you, sir." And then he looked down at the photographs, and he read out loud, "Love and best wishes to," and said, he read his grandchild's name. And he put that over in the back, and he read the next one's name. And he read the third one's name, and his chin began to quiver, and tears ran down his cheeks, and mine too. And he said in effect, "Why don't we try one more time?"
I don't know if anybody else gets a little misty-eyed when they hear that, but very personal insight. Even before that, I think it was on maybe the 6th or 7th day, Anwar Sadat had enough of Menachem Begin. He announced he was going to be leaving the summit. An aide comes to Carter, says there's bags on the porch on Sadat's porch. He's going to be leaving. Carter goes to confront him about this. And in Carter's book, A Full Life: Reflections at 90, he writes that this was the most uncomfortable conversation of his entire life. And so on that same occasion, when I heard that the diplomatic relations with China was the most important accomplishment of his presidency, I also took the opportunity to ask him why that was. How could that be the most uncomfortable conversation of your life? Because you've been through quite a bit. And what he told me was, what he responded with was that it was uncomfortable because this was not just a colleague, it wasn't just a peer, that this was a very close friend of his, that he had a very close relationship with Sadat. Not as much with Begin. Begin had just come to power when Carter had, but Sadat had been in the political landscape for quite some time there as president of Egypt, I think since the early 70s. But he had a really good relationship with Sadat, and he said that I knew I had to go and threaten my very good friend. And what he told Sadat was that if he left the summit, chances are he would be blamed for its failure. The United States probably would not continue to support Egypt diplomatically, economically, culturally, and most importantly, their friendship would be off the table. And he said that was enough to convince Anwar Sadat to stay and not leave the Camp David Accords. And Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin both do get Nobel Peace Prizes for the summit. They both openly said Carter should have got it. He does get a Nobel Peace Prize a little later, I believe 2003, though.
The last day.
Oh, sorry. Another big part of Carter's presidency, a lot of folks aren't aware of, is protecting parks, forests, wildlife, our federal public lands. He protected more than 100 million acres of land during his 4 years as president. That included 34 new national monuments, parks, forests, wildlife refuges. The bulk of that comes in 1980 with passage and him signing the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act, because Alaska was kind of this thorn in the federal government side that had been there since they gained statehood in the Eisenhower administration. The can had essentially been kicked down the road for quite some time, and sorting out what lands went to the state of Alaska, what lands would be property of the federal government, what lands would go to Alaska Native tribes that were there. It's really not until we discover oil that a fire is kind of lit under the process, and we start trying to figure it out. Carter, I would say that it was very controversially uses the Antiquities Act of 1906 to kind of get Congress to the table, because they were dragging their feet on it. He just used executive authority through that law to declare national monuments throughout Alaska. And this is even when he's a lame duck president, as the term goes, after he loses the election in 1980 to Reagan. But more or less, he sends a signal to Congress, I'm still in office another month and a half. I can just keep on signing away national monuments unless you come to the table and have a say in it, and we agree on a compromise. And he does get that done. And it essentially is the most significant conservation legislation in our nation's history. We do offer a program presentation on that if anyone's interested after the three-part series is over. But we see in the photograph here in 2016, the National Park Service makes Jimmy Carter an honorary National Park Ranger. They give him his own flat hat, a plaque, and that was the superintendent of the Park Service at the time, John Jarvis, to his left there. So we'll talk about his post-presidency. He does lose the election to Ronald Reagan in 1980. He and Rosalynn have to figure out their next steps. The family farm is about $1.5 million in debt. They do begin writing books. The sales from their books are enough to get them out of that debt. So then they go to figure out the next step, and that is where the Carter Center comes into play. We see President and Mrs. Carter here abroad, walking together in their Carter Center shirts. See, this was in South Sudan in 2011. So we have another video to watch, and this is an overview of what it is the Carter Center does. And again, this is a nonprofit organization. We share a campus with them, but they are independent of us, as we're, the federal government.
There are more than 7 billion faces on Earth, some full of hope and dreams, others empty with despair, constrained by barriers that keep them from healthy and productive lives. The Carter Center works to tear down those barriers and create a world where everyone has a chance to live in peace and enjoy basic human rights.
We are willing to take a chance that we might fail if we believe that the ultimate goal is worthwhile, worth our effort, and worth an investment in people who have been neglected by others. She gets three tablets.
The Carter Center has worked in over 80 countries to advance peace and fight devastating diseases.
Salam alaikum.
Over the years, the center has helped improve relations among nations and has worked to promote human rights, resolve conflicts, and strengthen democracies.
Did you vote? Yes. Congratulations.
The center has observed more than 100 elections in countries in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. As a result, leaders are held accountable to the people in places that have never had free and fair elections. The Carter Center is a leader in fighting neglected diseases like guinea worm, river blindness, trachoma, and lymphatic filariasis. These are gone from the developed world, but they still afflict some of the poorest people on Earth.
These diseases are all preventable. If the folks are just given a chance to know what they can do to improve their own lives, then they can transform their own lives into an opportunity for hope and self-respect and anticipation of a better future.
The center also strives to improve access to mental health care and reduce stigma and discrimination against those with mental illnesses.
So today is the last day that you will distribute here.
The people of the Carter Center work for peace, fight disease, and most importantly, bring hope to those who never had it before.
We were the poorest, most isolated people in the world. And often, if we weren't there, there would be nobody to help them.
The Carter Center works where the need is greatest to improve the lives of the poor, the disadvantaged, and those who have no voice.
How do I get out of my full screen here? One moment. Nope, that's not. There we go. Okay, sorry for that little delay. So that's an overview of what the Carter Center does. And I don't know if folks know this, we have only eradicated one disease in all of human history, and that would be smallpox. They mentioned Carter Center's work with guinea worm disease. Basically, when people don't have access to clean drinking water, they ingest microbes that then grow into these larger worms inside their body that cause a whole host of problems. I believe when the Carter Center started working on that, there were about 13.5 million people afflicted with guinea worm disease. Today, the number is below 20. It has gotten as low as, I think, 4 or 5. They saw a little resurgence when they began noticing guinea worms jumping to canines and canines somehow spreading it to humans. But if they are successful in that, it would be the second disease eradicated in human history. And then I think things like that are a great example that just because you're not president anymore doesn't mean you still can't be a leader in the world and accomplish things that impact people's lives all around the world. And the Carters have been given a host of different awards. We have some of them highlighted here. Medals of Freedom on the right, awarded to President and Mrs. Carter by President Bill Clinton, we attribute that quote to that they have done more good things for more people in more places than any other couple on the face of the earth. On the left is Carter's Nobel Prize. He wins in 2003 for his humanitarian work. An interesting thing about Nobel Peace Prizes in Atlanta is that nowhere else on earth are two different Nobel Prizes more closely located than here in Atlanta. We have Carter's at the Carter Library, and we have Martin Luther King Jr.'s at the King Center, which is just a little over a mile down the road from us here in Atlanta. The one you see on the bottom there, where you see an automatic weapon from Nicaragua, that was presented to the Carters who did election monitoring there as a gesture of, this gun, this violence that we saw in our elections in the past is now a relic. We now have peaceful elections. So we have a lot of artifacts related to the work of the Carter Center. In fact, I would say about a third of our floor space in the museum here in Atlanta is dedicated to the Carters post-presidency and the work they did and they continue to do with the Carter Center. So maybe for your life to be extraordinary, it has to be long, maybe, maybe not. Carter had, he defeated brain cancer at 92 years of age. I've heard President Carter remark that at that point in time, he was saying his goodbyes to everyone, coming to accept his end of life at that point, but he does come out of brain cancer in his 90s. He is the longest living president in United States history, born 1924. He and Rosalynn, just a few weeks ago, celebrated their 77th wedding anniversary, which just happens to be the average lifespan of Americans. They've been married for a lifetime, literally. In fact, I myself got some good advice from Rosalynn Carter. I went down the Plains to attend one of President Carter's Sunday schools presentations at the Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains. I was there with some of the volunteers at the museum. We were surprised and brought to a small room and given an audience with Mrs. Carter. I was getting ready to get married at that time. I asked her if she had any advice she said, well, her and Jimmy enjoyed doing a lot of things together and having shared interests just as much. They like to have their own lives and to get away from each other. So I think that's pretty good advice, and I think it's worked out pretty good for me and my wife so far. But here we see them at, this was 2 wedding anniversaries ago in 2021. There we see the Clintons, President Bill Clinton, and then former Secretary of State, former United States Senator, former First Lady, former Democratic Party presidential nominee, Hillary Clinton, who actually worked in the Carter administration when she was still just Hillary Rodham. So there's a connection there beyond Bill Clinton being president, her being nominated for president. She was an employee of Jimmy Carter while he was in the White House. So we've went over a lot of things in Jimmy Carter's life, but I found this quote here, and I think this really sums up his secret to how he's led such an extraordinary life. And I'll read it out loud for everyone. Jimmy says, "I have one life and one chance to make it count for something. My faith demands that I do whatever I can, wherever I am, whenever I can, for as long as I can, with whatever I have to try to make a difference." And I think that's what he's doing in the photograph we see here. This was taken in the South Bronx in October of 1977. Jimmy Carter was on his way to the United Nations to sign the International Declaration of Human Rights and to speak before the UN Assembly. At that time, the Bronx, actually most of the Bronx, was on fire. I don't know if anyone remembers this from the late 70s, but they had initiated a new fire response system. Didn't work so well. A lot of buildings caught on fire. A lot of residents were rendered homeless. Carter made an unannounced stop in the South Bronx on the way to the UN building to meet some people and talk with folks affected by it there. And that's what we see happening in that photograph there. So it seems like whether it's a smaller gesture like that to let people know that they're thinking about them, larger overtures like he makes at the Camp David Peace Accords, I think Carter really did live that statement there, to doing whatever he can, whenever he can, with whatever he's got to make a difference in people's lives, has worked out pretty well for him. So maybe that's some great wisdom all of us can take with us from this program today, that just try to make a difference, whether big or small. So that is the end of my program, and I can provide this as a PDF slide presentation. I do have hyperlinks, as you see here, and throughout the presentation in the citations. I think even some of the videos have a hyperlink to where you can find those. So feel free to look into it a little deeper, have that further inquiry, be more curious about our 39th president. You can see us on social media. We have a brand new website, it's pretty nice looking. You can see our frequently requested research topics, where we've already curated some primary sources for you. You can take a virtual tour of our museum to see what that looks like. If you're an educator or know anyone who is, or maybe have kids or grandkids in school, we have teacher resources. We offer professional development for teachers. The Carter Center has resources as well for educators. You can check out the National Park Services site for the Carter National Historical Park. National Archives educator resources, and Docs Teach is a website run by the National Archives and the National Archives Foundation. Also has access to primary sources and teaching activities and lesson plans. So go ahead, and I'm going to stop sharing. And now if anybody has any questions, comments, anything Carter related or related to the library, National Archives, I'm happy to do my best to provide you with an answer. So feel free to let me know what's on your mind.
So Josh, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much. That was really remarkable and inspiring, and appreciate your willingness to share the slides. So what I'll do is, after this is recorded, I'll send out a link to the recording of your program, and if it's okay, attach the PDF of the slides with it.
Absolutely.
So everybody can get that afterwards.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that okay?
That's totally fine.
Okay.
That's why I'm making the sharing with people.
So I guess the first question is, does anybody have any specific questions for Josh about his program today? Okay, Becky, you're on.
Hey, I was wondering, since we've heard so much about the National Archives with former President Trump, do you legally own what's there? Does the archives own?
So at our site, we're interesting. We're a little unique. It's President Carter that signs the Presidential Records Act, which becomes a law mandating retention, all documentation of a presidential administration. He is not bound to it. He was grandfathered in. He volunteers to set the example and donates the overwhelming majority of his presidential collection to the National Archives. So in a sense, it belongs to the National Archives, but the National Archives belong to all of us. So it belongs to the American people, technically speaking. Anyone that wants to come and do research with us, you have access to all of those things I mentioned, the photographs, the written documents. Artifacts a little more trickier with that. They're hard to bring out of storage for that. But as far as photos, written documents, audio and video, you can go to our website, submit an Ask an Archivist form, schedule an appointment. Even if you can't come with us in person, we can still requisition what you're looking for, share it with you online, digitally through email. That's because these things belong to you. So now if you hear any mention of presidents before Carter, those all belong to them. And anything that they have at their presidential libraries were either donated or are on loan to them. Some of them might be owned by their cooperating foundations. Each presidential library site's a little bit different in how they operate. But yes, they belong to all of us.
Did any previous president or the family try to sell things related to the president?
Oh, well, that happened quite a bit. As I mentioned, that was a big reason FDR wanted to begin the presidential library system, because that's usually what happened was when a president went out, staff would just hold on to things. If it was something important, sell it to the highest bidder, keep it for themselves. A lot of it was just discarded, destroyed. There was really no formal system of retention and preservation of presidential documents. Even with the presidential libraries being established, there technically wasn't, but it provided a mechanism to begin to do that.
Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome.
So Josh, just to clarify, what President Carter signed was a requirement to submit the paperwork before because we had a program in FDR and they talked about establishing the system, but I guess it wasn't legally required to submit the papers, the documents. Is that what you're saying? It's a difference?
Yes.
And that was in reaction to what happened or concerns about what's happening with Nixon, I think.
Right. In response to what?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
They were concerned that Nixon's papers would not be willingly archived and properly stored.
Right. I mean that was around the first, like when Carter's elected president. While they have the largest number of voters turnout, the voter percentage turnout was down something like 10 or 15% from the previous decade. And so I think that was one of those olive branches he was putting out there, trying to make peace with the Watergate scandal, trying to restore trust in the office of the presidency.
Right.
And and Carter did, and there was a lot of controversial things he did. With Vietnam War had ended in 1975, Carter signed an executive order pardoning any draft evaders as long as they had not renounced their citizenship. So on one hand, he's trying to make peace with Watergate. On the other hand, he probably riled up a lot of folks who went to Vietnam, whether they liked it or not. So it's a very, Carter's got a very complex presidency, I would say, that can't really be defined by contemporary party lines, I would say. I think he's a great president for young people to study today, to realize, hey, there was a time when sometimes you straddle both sides of the aisle there on things.
Thank you.
You're very
Okay.
welcome.
So we're running a little over. Any other question? Oh, wait, Radinsky. You got your hand up? We can't hear you though. No? I see, no question. Okay. So I think we're gonna wrap up. Don't forget, we've got part 2 next month on Camp David Accords. We'll send out a reminder to everybody. And Josh, it was great spending some time with you. We really appreciate your expertise. Oh, you're getting some applause.
Oh, thank
So,
you.
yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you all for being here with us
Yeah.
today. This
So
is wonderful.
it was really enlightening, and we look forward to seeing you again in September.
Great. Looking forward to it myself. And we'll be
Okay.
talking really in depth about the Camp David Accords.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. See you in a little
Bye.
bit.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.